Sunday, the 22nd of September of last year, in broad daylight, the life of 15-year-old Daejaun Campbell was snuffed out when he was stabbed to death on a street in Woolwich. His fatal wounds were inflicted by you, Imre Doue, with a large machete with which you had quite deliberately armed yourself, as you admitted to the jury that you had done hundreds of times before. You were convicted of Daejaun's murder by the jury, who rejected your false assertion that you were acting in lawful self-defence. You, Marko Balaz, were convicted of manslaughter on the basis that you encouraged and or assisted Imre Doue to stab Daejaun, but without the requisite intent for murder. There is no question that was the jury's findings, because that was how I directed them in the route to verdict. You are both here today to be sentenced for your involvement in Daejaun's killing. You, Imre Doue, are also here for possession of the machete, which was the murder weapon. You, Marko Balaz, are also to be sentenced for drugs offences. Daejaun Campbell was, in his mother's words, quotes, an incredible human being, son, brother, cousin, and friend. He was loyal to a fault, caring, compassionate, helpful, understanding, and a brilliant communicator. She describes how he excelled at sport. The grief which his violent death has caused is immeasurable. It is felt most keenly by his mother, but also by his grandmother, his siblings, other family members, and friends. The impact of Daejaun's death reaches far and wide, and his death has left behind a huge void. His mother, who has behaved throughout this case with dignity, asks herself the same question that we ask on a daily basis in this court: when will this knife crime epidemic end? As she rightly says, enough young lives have been lost already, and nothing that I can do today can bring Daejaun back, or, it seems, stop others from behaving as you two did. Daejaun was himself a victim of local gang culture and had clearly been groomed and sucked into a life of Class A drug dealing, as so many young, disaffected teenagers in this city are. He had entered a world where the carrying of lethal knives was the norm. In his naivety, he no doubt believed that carrying a knife would protect him. His mother truly believes that he was on the very brink of giving up his criminal lifestyle and that he was due to go back to school the day after he was murdered. Thanks to the actions of the two of you, he will never do so. He will never be able to capitalise on all the positive attributes which he clearly had. Before turning to the facts, I make it clear that where I make findings adverse to either of you, I do so to the criminal standard. On the 22nd of September of last year, the two of you met up together with Jacob Losevich, who was acquitted of any offence. Jacob Losevich drove you to an address to which he had access in Eglinton Road in Woolwich. You had been to the address before. From that address could be seen a well-trodden path where you knew you might find local boys such as Daejaun Campbell, who for some reason, no doubt related to some sort of pathetic gang rivalry, was a target of your aggression and needed to be G-checked. Perhaps you didn't bargain for the fact that Daejaun would be armed with a knife himself, or that he would try to stand his ground. As you saw Daejaun head up the path, you ambushed him. You had your heads and faces covered. You, Imre Doue, had a large zombie-style machete in a sheath. When you reached the top of the path, you confronted Daejaun, who quickly dropped his knife. His knife broke, and from that moment he was defenceless. I completely reject the assertion that he had a second knife. As you told the jury, Imre Doue, adrenaline kicked in, and the two of you chased Daejaun as he tried to run away. You, Imre Doue, stabbed him a total of 8 times. One wound was to his head, and other injuries to his arm and hands were caused when he tried to protect his head from further injury. You also stabbed his thigh and ankle. The fatal injury was delivered with at least moderate force as Daejaun was running away. Your machete cut the femoral vein in his leg and penetrated to such a depth that the knife hit the pelvic bone. You may not have intended to kill Daejaun, but there was an extremely high likelihood of death, bearing in mind the location of that fatal wound and the nature of the weapon which you used. You, Marko Balaz, were right there. You provided backup, knowing that Imre Doue had drawn his machete, and as the jury found, you encouraged him to stab Daejaun, intending that Daejaun suffer significant, albeit not really serious, harm from stab wounds. A local and compassionately tended to him until the emergency services arrived. Daejaun was begging her, "Don't let me die, I'm only 15. She tried to persuade his supposed friend to stay at the scene, but he headed off before the police arrived, not wanting to get involved. As Daejaun lay bleeding to death and calling for his mother, you two ran off, taking the machete with you. You went back to Eglinton Road, where you both laid low for some hours. You, Marko Balaz, had to be home by 9 p.m. to comply with the curfew, which was one of the bail conditions for the drugs offences. You ordered a taxi in a false name, and having been collected some distance away from Eglinton Road, you headed home. Following your arrest, you told a pack of lies in your police interview. You, Imre Doue, did not go home. You told the jury that you enlisted the help of a caring friend who was clearly a fellow criminal, who helped you to get rid of your phone, blood-stained clothing, and the murder weapon. I have no doubt that there was incriminating material on your phone which would have showed the motive for and the plan to attack. You obtained a new phone, changed your clothes, and went home much later that night. Meanwhile, Daejaun was pronounced dead at the scene. He had bled out from a major femoral vessel injury. The messages between you, Imre Doue, and your girlfriend show that you recognised what you had done and that you were facing a long sentence. You described it as karma. When in custody following your arrest, you were clearly distressed and owned up to being responsible, but you did not have the courage to plead guilty. During and since the trial, you have begun to realise the enormity of what you did. You, Marko Balaz, recorded images of the scene and of Daejaun. Whilst in custody, you boasted to your cousin and girlfriend that you had been responsible for the killing and that it was you that had stabbed Daejaun. Listening to those calls increased the distress for Daejaun's mother, who had to hear you showing off about her son's death, your involvement in it, and your complete dismissal that a young boy had died. In the light of the jury's verdict, however, I cannot be sure that you had a knife, and I will not sentence you on that basis, despite the contents of those prison calls. On the other hand, you did know that Imre Doue was armed with a machete. The two of you are no strangers to the carrying of knives. You, Imre Doue, are now 18. You were 17 at the date of the murder. You told the jury that you've regularly carried knives, including machetes, since you were 13. You have a caution from October 2020 for possession of a knife, when you were only 13. You have a conviction for possession of another knife 3 days later, for which a referral order was imposed. You have yet another conviction for possession of a knife less than 8 months later, in June 2021. That weapon was a large kukri knife. Less than a year before the murder, you were convicted of possession of a machete and a fray. For those offences, you received a 12-month youth rehabilitation order with intensive supervision. The murder was committed during the currency of that order, and it is quite clear to me that all attempts at helping you to leave that way of life behind you had failed despite intensive intervention. You, Marko Balaz, are now 19. You were 18 at the date of the killing. You have 2 separate convictions for possession of knives in 2023. You too failed to respond to intensive supervision. At the time of the killing, you were on bail with an electronically monitored curfew for possession with intent to supply cocaine, heroin and cannabis, and for possession of the criminal proceeds of your drug dealing. Those offences to which you very recently pleaded guilty occurred on the 8th of July of last year. At 7:15 that evening, you were stopped by police and found to have over £500 in cash, £60 worth of cannabis, and 17 wraps of crack cocaine. When you were searched more thoroughly, 13 more packages of cocaine and 5 of heroin were found hidden in your underwear. Examination of your phone revealed that you were advertising drugs for sale back to January of 2023. Imre Doue, you are now aged 18. At the date of the offence, you had recently turned 17. I begin with the murder, which carries a mandatory life sentence. As you were 17 at the date of the offence, I must order you to be detained during His Majesty's pleasure. I then have to determine the minimum term that you must serve before you can be considered for release by the parole board. You took a knife to the scene and had it available to use as a weapon and used it to commit the murder. Therefore, paragraph 5A of Schedule 21 of the 2020 Sentencing Act applies. That gives a starting point for the minimum term of 23 years based on your age at the time of the offence. I bear in mind that had you been 16, the starting point for the minimum term would have been 17 years. I then have to consider aggravating and mitigating factors. The relevant aggravating factors are 1, your numerous previous offences of knife possession and the fact that, as you told the jury, you have regularly carried a knife since the age of 13. 2, the obvious planning to confront Daejaun or someone else from the area, including the use of disguises, although to some extent the planning is reflected in the starting point, and I do not add significantly to the minimum term to reflect planning further. Thirdly, your actions after the murder of disposing of your clothing, phone and the murder weapon. And fourthly, the fact that you committed the offence during the currency of a youth rehabilitation order which had been imposed for knife possession and violence. Those matters would justify a significant increase in the minimum term. Turning to mitigation, I have read the intermediary report, the psychological report and the pre-sentence report. It is extremely depressing to note that despite a loving home, to which your mother refers in her statement, which I've also read, with a caring and responsible parent where you grew up as a well-behaved child with enormous potential. In 2020, when your mother was out of the country, you were clearly groomed by older boys and, like Daejaun, sucked into a world of gangs and knife crime. In August 2024, you were declared to have been a victim of child criminal exploitation. By September, your life consisted of smoking cannabis with your friends and wandering the streets of Woolwich with a lethal weapon. You have made good progress while on remand, and sadly now I think you are finally beginning to understand the dangers of carrying knives and the fact that young teenagers are being killed and others locked up for large parts of their lives. I accept that you now regret your actions and are to some extent remorseful. Your youth is already reflected in the reduced minimum term. I am prepared to find that you did not intend to kill Daejaun, but as I've already said, there was a very high risk of death, so that justifies little reduction in the minimum term. Having considered everything in the reports, including your immaturity and naivety, as well as your limited intelligence and understanding of what you were doing, and the remorse we are finally demonstrating, I have decided that the mitigating factors outweigh the aggravating factors, due not least to your youth. The minimum term I finally decided upon is one of 21 years. There will be a short concurrent sentence for the knife offence, which will be reduced by 33% to reflect your guilty plea. I will spell out the precise sentence at the end of these sentencing remarks. Marko Balaz, you are now 19. I begin with the manslaughter. I sentence you on the basis that you encouraged Imre Doue to stab Daejaun as part of a planned and targeted attack, but of course I recognise that you didn't intend that Daejaun should be killed or hurt very seriously, though you clearly intended significant injury. Having considered the sentencing guidelines, I have concluded that this offence falls within culpability B, due to the fact that the death was caused in the course of an unlawful act which must have involved an intention to cause harm just short of grievous bodily harm, and which carried a high risk of death or really serious harm, which ought to have been obvious to you. That gives a starting point of 12 years and a range of 8 to 16 years. However, your responsibility is reduced to some extent due to your significant learning disability, which I will treat as an important mitigating factor. The aggravating factors are, firstly, your previous convictions for knife possession, which are, in my view, relevant and sufficiently recent. Secondly, the fact that the offence was committed when you were on bail for serious drug offences. And thirdly, the fact that you were the subject of a youth rehabilitation order at the date of the offence. I have read the pre-sentence report, which accurately sets out your background and your future risk. The mitigation is your youth, your lack of maturity, and most importantly, your very significant learning disability, which means that you have an extremely low level of intellectual functioning and a very real mental impairment, which I am sure makes you more susceptible to negative influences and impulsive acts. Subject to the question of totality, to which I will return, I have concluded that the least sentence which is appropriate for the manslaughter on its own would have been one of 10 years. I then have to consider whether you qualify as a dangerous offender. Whilst I have concluded that you do so qualify, in the light of the sentence which I'm going to pass upon you, I do not consider that it would be appropriate further to extend the licence period, and therefore I propose to pass a determinate sentence upon you. I turn then to the drugs matters. Your offending falls within significant role at Category 3 of the relevant guideline, which for the Class A offences gives a starting point of 4.5 years and a range of 3.5 to 7 years. Concurrent short sentences are appropriate for the cannabis and criminal property offences. The aggravating factor is your failure to comply with earlier orders. The mitigation is the same as for the manslaughter offence. The sentence prior to consideration of your late pleas would be one of 42 months. That would be reduced to 34 months to reflect just under 20% credit before I deal with totality. Before I deal with the final sentences, I deal with ancillary matters. Any outstanding orders for either of you will be revoked, and I take no action on the breach of the conditional discharge in your case, Mr. Balas. The phone and money seized from you will be forfeited and the drugs destroyed, and you will both pay the statutory surcharge. Would you both please stand up? Imre Doue, for the planned murder of 15-year-old Daejaun, whom you targeted and stabbed to death with a lethal machete when he was defenceless and posed no threat to you, the sentence is detention at His Majesty's pleasure for a minimum term of 21 years to punish you for what you did. That is the term you will serve before being considered for parole, and you will not be released unless it is determined that you no longer pose a significant risk of harm to the public. For the possession of the knife, there will be a concurrent term of 8 months custody. You have spent 370 days on remand, which reduces the minimum term to one of 19 years and 360 days, and that is the term which I impose. Marko Balaz, in order to reflect totality, I do intend to reduce the sentence for the manslaughter in respect of which you participated in a fatal attack upon Daejaun with Imre Doue, who you knew was armed with a machete and who you encouraged to stab him. The sentence for that offence is 9 years detention. I reduce the sentence on counts 1 and 2 on the drugs indictment from 34 months to 2 years on each offence to run concurrently to each other, but consecutively to the 9 years, giving a total of 11 years detention. That will be reduced to 10 years and 328 days to reflect the qualifying curfew. For the cannabis offence and the criminal property offence, there will be concurrent 3-month sentences on each. Should my calculation of the days on remand or the qualifying curfew be incorrect, the parties must notify the court by 4:30 p.m. today, and I will have the case called back on and adjust the term. They may go down.
Or the machete attack and murder of Daejaun Campbell, who was 15 at the time. It occurred in Woolwich in September last year, and Imre Doue, excuse me, sentenced to a minimum of 21 years, less time served before he will be considered for parole. That was for a sentence for murder. Marko Balaz, 11 years headline sentence there, less time served as well. The judge referencing both of their previous history of knife possession, the two individuals both having 2 prior offences each for weapon offences, and also referencing the drug use by both of the individuals. Well, our Midlands correspondent Shemar Freeman-Powell has been following this case and can bring us more.
"Help," he screamed. "I'm 15, don't let me die." That was the desperate plea made by Daejaun Campbell after being chased down and stabbed by teenage boys. It was a call for help his mother was unable to answer. She only learned of these final words after his death.
What I love most about him was his intelligence. He was so intelligent. He was fun, he was witty. My biggest fear was to get that phone call that he was hurt. But instead, I'm living my worst nightmare, that he's no longer here. And in that, he didn't even get a second chance. He just died on the side of the road like a dog. Yeah. And the bit that hurts is that it could have been prevented.
Daejaun was the victim of an unprovoked stabbing in September last year. Following a trial, Imre Doue was found guilty of murder and Marko Balaz was found guilty of manslaughter. His death deeply impacted those who knew him, many of them also children. A motive was never established, but police believe he'd been exploited into selling drugs in the area at the time. A reality his mother had warned of. Prior to his death, she had monitored him closely, flagged concerns at school, and even attempted to give up parental responsibility, hoping it would save her son.
I never thought I'd have to make the call to ask for him to be removed, but as I said, I never kept my son's behaviour a secret. What I was experiencing, I never kept it a secret. His death was definitely preventable, because in all the help that I asked for, I was told that he doesn't meet the threshold. He doesn't meet the threshold for the help that I'm asking for, and they need to go back and we need to exhaust all these areas. And I'm like, I've already exhausted them.
His mother says a response for her calls for action was only made the day after Daejaun was killed.
The focus should be more around prevention. I find that in the situation I now find myself in, there are no preventative measures in place. But in asking for the help to prevent what's happened to my baby, that wasn't given. But in his passing, I've got all these professionals coming to me now, offering me all the help they think they can. And I'm thinking, what's the point now? I needed this help to prevent this happening.
A spokesperson for the council said, Daejaun's death stunned our borough and we are still feeling the impact of the heinous crime that took place. We can't comment because there is an ongoing, independent, formal child safeguarding review which will examine the circumstances that led to his tragic death. That process is independent and involves Daejaun's family and is expected to finish later this year. The teenagers responsible now know how much of their lives will be spent behind bars, but his mother is not convinced that that means justice has been served.
A lot more needs to be done, and even more needs to be done to hold these adults to account. There's not enough deterrent. The justice that I think, or they tell me I'm going to get, is not enough, because the people who groomed him still get to live their life. as though everything's okay. They get to groom other people's children to do their dirty work. And I get to sit here trying to figure out how I'm going to live with this pain.
Siobhan Freeman-Powell, Sky News.
Well, we can speak to our correspondent, Siobhan Freeman-Powell, who is at the Old Bailey for us now. And Siobhan, tragic testimony there from a grieving mother, but incredibly powerful comments too about some of the issues that she foresaw.
Absolutely. That was an incredibly emotional interview with Daejaun's mother, Jodianne, in the months following Daejaun's death, where she spoke about signs in the change of his behaviour and how she had done all the things she could have done as his mother to try and raise the alarm and get him the help that he needed. But she says that that help was offered too late. And today at the Old Bailey, we are now here for the sentencing of 2 teenage boys who took Daejaun's life. This was also referenced in the judge's sentencing remarks. She says that Daejaun's death is no doubt related to some pathetic gang rivalry, and that Daejaun was targeted because it's believed that he was groomed and exploited into selling drugs in the area at the time. And this is, of course, because Daejaun Campbell was in the area of Woolwich, Edlington Road, last year, September, when the court heard that these 2 teenagers at the time, Imre Doue and Marko Balaz, had spotted Daejaun and targeted him in what the judge referred to as a G-check. The prosecution had also referenced the fact that Daejaun was defenceless during this trial. In sentencing remarks, the judge pointed out that Daejaun had actually had a weapon on him at the time of this incident, but he had dropped his knife and the knife had broke, meaning that he was defenceless at the time. And these 2 men who have now been sentenced, one for manslaughter and one for murder, had stabbed in a total of 8 times, 1 wound to his head and the other injuries to his hands and his arms, likely caused when he was trying to defend himself. Now, when sentencing, the judge also referenced Daejaun's mother, describing the dignity that she had when addressing the court. She also asked to question Daejaun's mother in her witness statement about when this knife epidemic was going to end. The judge said that this is also a question the court asks itself on a daily basis, saying that enough young lives have already been lost, and also referencing that as this case, Daejaun, who was only 15 years old at the time of his murder, is no longer alive, and these 2 young men will also now be facing long time behind bars too.
Yes, Siobhan, 21 years in prison for that murder and 11 years for manslaughter. And the judge also referencing their prior history of knife possession as well.
That's right, yeah. It was quite a lengthy sentencing from the judge there in mitigation. The defence for Imre Doue was the fact that he was also incredibly young at the time of this incident, only 14 months older than Daejaun at the time. It's also believed that he could have been the victim of exploitation too, and also had previous offences of carrying weapons.
Both of these young men, relatively young in years, but both given substantial sentences.
Yes, that's right. In summing up the case, the judge described why those lengthy sentences were handed down. She said that Daejaun Campbell, who was just 15 years old at the time, was stabbed a total of 8 times, 1 wound to his head, the other injuries to his arms and his hands likely caused when he was trying to defend himself. During that sentencing, the judge said that this act was no doubt related to some pathetic gang rivalry, is how she had described it, speaking about the fact that Daejaun Campbell, in the months leading up to his death, had likely been exploited into selling drugs. Now, this is something that Daejaun's mother had spoken to Sky News about. Jodianne, Daejaun's mum, claims that in the months leading up to her son's death, she had been warning about a change in his behaviour. She said Daejaun was an intelligent, fun and witty child, but that that in the months before his death, she had noticed a change. He became anxious and secretive, and she said she did everything within her power to try and get help. This is what she told us. "Help," he screamed. "I'm 15, don't let me die." That was the desperate plea made by Daejaun Campbell after being chased down and stabbed by teenage boys. It was a call for help his mother was unable to answer. She only learned of these final words after his death.
What I love most about him was his intelligence. He was so intelligent. He was fun. He was witty. My biggest fear was to get that phone call that he was hurt. But instead, I'm living my worst nightmare, that he's no longer here. And in that, he didn't even get a second chance. He just died on the side of the road like a dog. Yeah. And the bit that hurts is that it could have been prevented.
Daejaun was the victim of an unprovoked stabbing in September last year. Following a trial, Imre Doue was found guilty of murder and Marko Balaz was found guilty of manslaughter. His death deeply impacted those who knew him, many of them also children. A motive was never established, but police believe he'd been exploited into selling drugs in the area at the time. A reality his mother had warned of. Prior to his death, she had monitored him closely, flagged concerns at school, and even attempted to give up parental responsibility, hoping it would save her son.
I never thought I'd have to make the call to ask for him to be removed, but as I said, I never kept my son's behaviour a secret. What I was experiencing, I never kept it a secret. His death was definitely preventable, because in all the help that I asked for, I was told that he doesn't meet the threshold. He doesn't meet the threshold for the help that I'm asking for, and they need to go back and we need to exhaust all these areas. And I'm like, I've already exhausted them.
His mother says a response for her calls for action was only made the day after Daejaun was killed.
The focus should be more around prevention. I find that in the situation I now find myself in, there are no preventative measures in place. But in asking for the help to prevent what's happened to my baby, that wasn't given. But in his passing, I've got all these professionals coming to me now, offering me all the help they think they can. And I'm thinking, what's the point now? I needed this help to prevent this happening.
A spokesperson for the council said, Daejaun's death stunned our borough and we are still feeling the impact of the heinous crime that took place. We can't comment because there is an ongoing, independent, formal child safeguarding review which will examine the circumstances that led to his tragic death. That process is independent and involves Daejaun's family and is expected to finish later this year. The teenagers responsible now know how much of their lives will be spent behind bars, but his mother is not convinced that that means justice has been served.
A lot more needs to be done, and even more needs to be done to hold these adults to account. There's not enough deterrent. The justice that I think, or they tell me I'm going to get, is not enough. Because the people who groomed him still get to live their life as though everything's okay. They get to groom other people's children to do their dirty work. And I get to sit here trying to figure out how I'm going to live with this pain.
Siobhan Freeman-Powell, Sky News.
I'm reading this statement on behalf of my niece, Daejaun Taylor, who was Daejaun's mum. Our children no longer have the luxury of scarred lives. As parents, we live and die in fear. Fear that our children, maybe next fear, justice will once again look the other way. We're told to stay calm, to trust the system, to wait for change. But how many more children must be buried before this country finally admits it has failed them? How many more mothers must scream into pillows because the streets have become open graves? The system is not broken. It is functioning exactly as it was built, to protect itself, to preserve its appearance, and to silence truth. Every time another child dies, we get the same rehearsed apology, the same reports, the same empty phrases. Lessons will be learnt. But no lessons ever are, because no one in power pays the price. Daejaun wasn't the first, and heartbreakingly, he won't be the last. They will sit in their offices, write new talking points, wait for our pain to fade from the headlines. It never does. It just moves home, from one grieving mother to another. And to those who led this country, Keir Starmer, Sadiq Khan, David Lammy, you speak of reform while our children die. You talk about unity while your inaction tears families apart. You issue condolence, then return to comfort. We live with the aftermath. Your words build nothing. Your silence buries everything. Daejaun was robbed of his entire future, yet the perpetrators still have one. One of them, the driver, walks free. He has been home for months. He sits at home surrounded by warmth and laughter, while I sit surrounded by silence and ashes. He gets to hold his family. I hold my son's memory. If that is justice, then justice itself is dead. The devastation left behind can't be contained in a courtroom or captured in a statement. The authorities knew who those boys were. They always do. They had a chance to act and didn't. The system keeps giving second chances to those who destroy lives, and no chances to lives they destroy. So no, the system hasn't failed us. It has abandoned us. Until it learns to protect the innocent before it comforts the guilty, more mothers will stand where I stand, and more names like Daejaun's will be carved into stone long before their time. Those who choose violence are given chances. Those who choose love are given graves.
A powerful statement there by Shalona Brown, who was the aunt of Daejaun Campbell. He was the 15-year-old victim in this stabbing. Just listening in to see if something else is said down there.
These perpetrators that can bring Daejaun back. And with that timeline, is that the same time period I've got to piece my life back together? Is that the same time period I get to build my family back? So no, justice wasn't served. It will never be.
Well, their family tributes to Daejaun Campbell, the 15-year-old who died, and frustration by his aunt, Shalona Brown, talking about the apologies that those in authority give to the families when someone dies. But she says nothing changes because no one in power is affected. Talked about people like Keir Starmer and Sadiq Khan and David Lammy say you speak of reform while our children die, you issue condolences and then return to comfort. She says that the family feel that the system has not just failed them but has abandoned them. The family there of Daejaun Campbell.